President Trump has said that if Putin doesn't agree to compromise, he will arm Ukraine to the teeth, and he will back them with all the might that the United States has. Well, let me state first, I think it's for the Ukrainians to articulate their own position. But let's do this. Let's set out a maximalist position from the Ukrainians. They would want all of their territory restored, including Crimea. They would want a pathway to EU membership, and they would want a pathway to NATO membership as quickly as possible. They'd want security guarantees if NATO membership wasn't available immediately until it could be available. And they'd want economic assistance to help rebuild their country. Okay, that's what we would like if an ideal situation. That is probably unattainable. So now the question is, what can you achieve realistically with less than that? And how much territory do you need to cede? Is EU membership on the table? How long will that take? Is NATO membership on the table? And how long will that take? And in the interim, are there any security guarantees? And again, how can you stabilize the border with Russia in the interim until Ukraine does become a NATO member? And again, all these complexities about how long the border is, who the peacekeeping forces are going to be, how you're going to verify it, what weapons are you going to allow Ukraine to possess, if that's going to be part of the negotiation also. Is there going to be basically zones of demilitarized? So yes, there's going to be a deconfliction point like the DMZ in North and South Korea, but is there going to be areas where neither side can have advanced weapons that could threaten the other? So again, lots of possibilities. The key is, how can you make Ukraine more secure, more safe, and over the long term prosperous while maintaining its sovereignty so that this doesn't happen again in another 5 or 10 or 15 years?
Well, on that point, what would be your response, Ambassador, to the argument that a lot of Ukraine supporters make, which is that if there's any kind of negotiated peace that involves the long-term ceding of sovereign Ukrainian territory to Vladimir Putin's Russia, that the Kremlin will sell that as a win, and that in 5 or 10 years' time, some point down the line, it'll be back, be it in Ukraine or in the Baltic states?
That's right. That's exactly the concern. So how do you know they just don't reboot and rearm and we have at this again where they attack Ukraine? And again, there's no guarantees, unfortunately, but there are things that you can do in order to make that less likely. And so this is where integrating Ukraine as much as possible into a security architecture that would deter Russia from aggression again is absolutely essential. And again, how you do that, what type of architecture, what the mechanisms are, what the timing is, that's really where the diplomacy is going to need to take place.
And just taking, for example, that sort of shopping list that you laid out of the best case scenario Ukraine might want, of those options, which do you think are the most realistic? Is it, for example, a pathway to EU and NATO membership?
Well, I certainly think that Ukraine should have had a pathway to EU membership years ago. They had all sorts of internal problems with corruption, a lack of transparency and accountability. I think it's been a new day in Ukraine for some time, so I would hope that the EU could fast track membership for them. I don't think that's as threatening to Moscow as NATO membership is, and it's particularly if you're going to deploy NATO troops along that border. But again, that's something to be negotiated. If I was a Ukrainian, I'd want ironclad or as close to ironclad guarantees of my security as possible. And how you secure that is going to be where the devil is, because those are the details. And again, Ukraine's going to actually have 2 sets of negotiations, to be very clear. They're going to have a negotiation with Russia to settle the war, and then they're going to have a negotiation with Europe and NATO in order to figure out how Ukraine can live in a Western economic zone, a Western security zone. And those are 2 separate negotiations. Obviously, they're related, but that's part of what makes this such a complicated diplomatic dance.
Understandably, so much of the conversation around Ukraine and Russia at the moment focuses on Donald Trump and what he's likely to do when he takes office in January. But of course, there are still 2 months of the Biden administration to go. Do you think we will see any major announcements with regards to Ukraine in the coming months? According to reports, Keir Starmer and President Macron of France may try and persuade the Biden administration one more time to allow Ukraine to use long-range Storm Shadow and Scalp missiles. on targets inside Russia. Do you think we may see some movement there or elsewhere?
Well, if they haven't been able to persuade them for the last 2 years, it's hard to see how they're going to persuade them in the last 2 months of this administration. I think that's been part of Ukraine's frustration, is that the delivery of arms has been slow, and those that have come are not the more lethal weapons that they believe they need and deserve in order to defend themselves. So I don't see a great deal of change coming from European instigation. I have read earlier today that the Biden administration is going to make sure that all the weapons that have been promised will be shipped by January 20th. So that perhaps is something. I know that the U.S. is now sending technicians over there to help repair systems for the Ukrainians. That's long overdue in my view. But I think that we're going to have to wait and see what the president wants to do, who his Secretary of State will be, who his Secretary of Defense will be. We don't know those positions yet. In Washington, the aphorism is that personnel is policy. And so we'll see what views those individuals might have. But, this 75, 76-day interregnum between the election and January 20th is a little bit fraught, a little bit more anxious than normal, because there is a lack of government authority now. This administration is on the way out. People are cleaning up their resumes, looking for other jobs. Other people are trying to move in as quickly as possible, but they don't have any government authority yet. So it is an opportunity for folks around the world to misbehave. I just watch this space, but I don't think there's going to be any major changes on the ground in the next 70 days or so.
And just finally, to return to that point about a potential timeline for a peace agreement or a negotiated settlement of some kind, how long do you think it might take? I mean, okay, take it with a pinch of salt when Donald Trump talks about 24 hours and he can end this war. But do you think within the first few months of him taking office, we may see a major breakthrough? Or do you think in a year's time, we will still very much be talking about fighting in Ukraine?
Well, again, it takes two to tango, so a lot of it's going to depend on what Russia and Ukraine want to do. I think it's possible to have a ceasefire within a relatively short period of time, certainly within the first 6 months of the Trump administration. Then working out the details while that ceasefire is preserved could take a year or probably longer. So I think it may happen in phases if it's going to happen. But I do think it's possible that there should be a ceasefire by the middle of this coming year.
What is your sense of how he's likely to approach things?
Well, I think it's always prudent to be very cautious in interpreting anything that President Trump says, especially on the campaign trail, as gospel. I think he says a lot of things. Some of it is simply to test out certain ideas. Others are provocative, perhaps on purpose. On Ukraine, he's actually said a lot of things, and most of the more controversial ones have been reported, such as he'll end the conflict in a day. But he's also had a lot more thoughtful comments about it and what it would take to end this terrible conflict and how he believes it should come to a conclusion as soon as possible for the benefit of everyone.
So when, for example, he said that comment about I could end the war in 24 hours, should we discount that? I mean, it's been widely seen that he is more skeptical about support for Ukraine than the Biden administration has been. Or do you think that is purely a bluff and that he may actually turn out to be more supportive of Ukraine than many people think?
I think it's actually neither. I think he's indicating or signaling, if you will, by these statements that he believes that he is perhaps uniquely able to bring an end to this conflict. I think that he feels that he should have won the Nobel Peace Prize for the Abraham Accords in his first term. I think he sees this as a vehicle for him ending a conflict and winning the Nobel Peace Prize, something that was given to President Obama but was denied to him. So I think that he is actually a little bit more thoughtful about what it's going to take. He knows that it takes compromise on both sides. And as far as the Biden administration, let's remember that President Trump actually released weapons to Ukraine that the Obama administration had prevented, including Javelin anti-tank weapons. He placed sanctions on Russia when he was president, and he opposed Germany's Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline to Russia because it would make Germany overly dependent on Russia for energy security. So I think if you look at the full record, you'll see that he hasn't exactly been a pushover for Mr. Putin.
One of the ideas that reportedly is on the table that Trump and his advisors are looking at is this idea of a demilitarized zone between Russia and Ukraine, a bit like you have between North and South Korea. Do you think that is feasible?
Well, that's an idea I think that General Kellogg had aired earlier this year. Um, it's difficult, let's put it this way. It's not quite North and South Korea. You have 1,200 kilometers as where the battle lines currently are that you'd have to demilitarize. So that's a very long border that would have to be patrolled. Where would the demilitarized zone consist of? Would it come from the territory you're going to cede to Russia? Would it come from additional Ukrainian territory? Who is going to make sure that the peace is kept in that demilitarized zone? How are you going to verify that it's being kept in that zone? What's the mechanism for trying to resolve any issues that arise because of it? So these are extremely complicated details. To be honest, I don't think anybody, whether in the United States or Europe or even Ukraine, has thought through all the implications right now.
I was speaking to someone earlier, a Times journalist who covers the war in Ukraine, and he said that if this idea of a demilitarized zone would probably at the moment appeal more to Kyiv than it would to Moscow because Ukraine are anxious. They might be in a mood now to freeze the front lines because of the advances that Russia are making. But from Moscow's point of view, they would be more reluctant because, as you say, Ambassador, there is this issue of, well, who would be patrolling it? Who would be policing it? And if you had, say, NATO troops in land bordering Russia, you can understand why Vladimir Putin would consider that a non-starter.
Well, it's a truism. It's going to take both sides to make compromises. If Russia feels that it has the upper hand and doesn't need to compromise now, then it'll continue to pursue the fighting. I think the Ukrainians have been remarkably brave and courageous in fending off a much larger country. And so it's unclear exactly where both sides are psychologically in terms of wanting to end this right now. But again, it's all on the question of whose terms are going to prevail, who has the greatest amount of leverage. And again, here's where the United States can come into play. President Trump has said that if Putin doesn't agree to compromise, he will arm Ukraine to the teeth. And he will back them with all the might that the United States has.
Thank you for watching today's episode of Frontline. For early access to our videos, member-only Q&As and live streams, then sign up for a membership via the link in the description. And for the latest news and breaking stories, listen to Times Radio and follow us at thetimes.com.